The impossible shot that changed war forever. What if I told you that a pull hall hustler from Boston rewrote military doctrine using geometry that West Point had never considered? That a single rifle shot, fired through a gap no wider than a playing card, would save hundreds of lives and spread across entire armies, yet the man who fired it would die completely unknown. This isn't Hollywood fiction. This is the true story of how Corporal James Jimmy Keller turned an impossible fortification into a death trap, and why the military tried to bury what he'd done. March 14, 1944, the Rapido River Valley, Italy. Corporal James Keller pressed his eye to the scope of his Springfield M1903 rifle, staring across for 180 yards of no-man's land at a German observation post that had killed 17 Americans in 3 weeks. The concrete bunker sat embedded in the mountainside like a malignant tumor, its firing slit offset at angles that made direct fire impossible. 3 snipers had already died trying to crack it. 14 infantrymen had been cut down in frontal assaults. Inside that bunker, a single German observer directed artillery fire that killed 8 Americans every day. Every patrol that crossed the valley floor, every supply convoy, every dawn advance. Within 90 seconds of movement, shells would rain down with surgical precision. Standard military doctrine said the position was invincible. Army engineers had studied it for weeks and found no solution. The concrete walls were 3 feet thick. The firing slit was barely 18 inches wide. In 4 minutes, Keller would fire a shot that military instructors would later call theoretically impossible. He would thread a bullet through a structural gap smaller than a deck of cards, bank it off a steel beam at precisely the right angle, and eliminate a target he couldn't even see. Within 6 weeks, his technique would spread to every Allied sniper division in Italy. By war's end, it would be credited with neutralizing over 100 fortified positions and saving an estimated 381 lives. Yet Keller's name appears in no official military records. No commendation, no medal, no mention in any training manual. The innovation that revolutionized sniper warfare became officially recognized doctrine, but the man who invented it died unknown, buried in an unmarked section of a Massachusetts cemetery. This is the story of how desperation, geometry, and a Boston dock worker's unconventional thinking changed modern warfare. And this is why the military establishment desperately wanted to pretend he'd never existed, the pull hall education nobody valued. James Keller grew up in a Charlestown, Massachusetts tenement that perpetually smelled of boiled cabbage and industrial oil. His father hauled munitions at the Charlestown Navy Yard for Depression-era wages, working 16-hour shifts that destroyed his back and spirit in equal measure. Their apartment had 3 rooms for 5 people. Privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford. Jimmy spent his childhood at Murphy's Pull Hall on Main Street not because he was trouble, but because he possessed a gift that nobody quite understood. While other 12-year-olds played stickball in the streets, Jimmy calculated deflection angles off cushions with an intuition that bordered on supernatural. He could sink combination shots that violated straight-line physics. Shots that required banking balls off 3 cushions, threading impossible gaps, using spin and angle in ways that made grown men shake their heads. Frank Murphy, the owner, noticed something remarkable about the kid. Most players saw the direct path from cue ball to target ball to pocket. Jimmy saw everything else: every cushion the ball could kiss, every angle it could take, every ricochet possibility that existed between here and there. "You think in ricochets," Frank told him one evening, watching the boy execute a 5-rail shot that shouldn't have worked. "Most people see 2 points and a straight line. You see a whole geometry of possibilities." Jimmy never considered this unusual. To him, the direct path was just one option among many, usually the worst option. The interesting shots required seeing angles nobody else noticed, exploiting gaps in what seemed like solid barriers, making the impossible look inevitable through precise calculation. He dropped out of high school at 16 when his father's back finally gave out completely. Someone had to work the family shift, Someone had to put food on the table. Education was another luxury they couldn't afford. By 1942, Jimmy was running a rigging crew at the Navy Yard. The work required reading engineering blueprints, calculating load-bearing angles for crane operations, understanding how forces distributed through complex structures. He excelled at it. His supervisors noted that Keller could visualize stress points and structural weaknesses that took engineers hours to calculate. He'd glance at a blueprint and immediately identify the optimal rigging configuration. When Pearl Harbor brought war to American shores, Jimmy enlisted the next morning. He didn't agonize over the decision, didn't wrestle with patriotic philosophy. His country needed bodies. He had one. The mathematics were simple. The recruiter saw a crane operator on his application and routed him to Fort Benning for standard infantry training. Nobody asked if he had any special skills. Nobody cared that he could calculate deflection angles in his head while most men needed slide rules. The rifle range changed everything. Keller qualified expert marksman with scores that made the drill instructors check his targets twice, suspecting fraud. But what caught their attention wasn't his accuracy. Plenty of farm boys could shoot straight. What disturbed them was his positions. Standard marksmanship taught 3 firing positions: prone, kneeling, standing. Keller would contort himself into bizarre configurations, shooting around barriers, under obstacles, using reflective surfaces. He'd wedge himself into corners that offered no clear line of sight and still hit center mass. He'd position himself at angles that looked wrong, that violated every geometric principle they taught. Kid shoots like he's playing billiards instead of war, one sergeant noted in his file. The comment wasn't meant as a compliment. They made him a sniper anyway. The army needed shooters and Keller could shoot. They shipped him to North Africa, then Sicily, then up the Italian boot with the 36th Infantry Division, grinding slowly northward against Wehrmacht positions that had been engineered by men who understood that concrete and geometry beat raw firepower. By March 1944, Keller had 19 confirmed kills, standard work, nothing remarkable. He followed doctrine precisely: find elevated position, establish range, compensate for wind and bullet drop, squeeze trigger slowly. Germans died. The war ground forward. Nobody asked him to think creatively. Nobody wanted innovation. They wanted reliable execution of proven tactics. Then came the Rapido River Valley. And then came the bunker that doctrine couldn't crack. The fortress that killed with mathematics. The Gustav Line fortifications represented 18 months of German engineering brilliance applied to the simple problem of killing Americans efficiently. Every bunker, every pillbox, every observation post had been designed by men who understood that proper positioning and concrete thickness could defeat numerical superiority. The Allies threw artillery at these positions for weeks. High explosive rounds created impressive craters that accomplished nothing. The Germans stayed underground during bombardments, then emerged when the shelling stopped and resumed killing. The craters just made the terrain harder for American infantry to cross. Monte Cassino dominated the valley like a malevolent god, its monastery ruins providing perfect observation over every approach route. German spotters watched American movements from positions so elevated and protected that counter-battery fire was essentially pointless. They called down artillery with almost casual precision, adjusting fire based on real-time observation, turning the valley floor into a killing ground where movement meant death. One particular observation post designated Strong Point 7 in intelligence report sat in a concrete bunker built into the mountainside for 180 yards from American lines. From that position, a single German observer had direct visual access to the entire valley floor. Whenever Allied forces attempted to advance, artillery shells arrived within 90 seconds. Whenever supply convoys tried to move forward, they were bracketed with fire before they'd traveled 50 yards. The bunker had been designed by someone who deeply understood ballistics and sniper tactics. The firing slit faced perpendicular to the most likely sniper positions, making direct shots geometrically impossible. The walls were reinforced concrete, 3 feet thick enough to stop anything short of a direct artillery hit, and the mountainside location made artillery targeting nearly impossible. Even if you achieved a perfect angle, the firing slit was only 18 inches wide and 8 inches tall, and the German observer stayed back from the opening, positioned deep in the bunker's interior where shadows made him effectively invisible. Standard doctrine said, suppress the observer. But strong point 7 made suppression impossible. You couldn't shoot what you couldn't see. You couldn't flank a position built into a mountainside. Lieutenant Marcus Chen of the 141st Infantry Regiment made the first serious attempt. He'd studied the position for 3 days, noting that morning light briefly illuminated the firing slit's interior. For maybe 30 seconds each dawn, if you had perfect timing and perfect conditions, you might silhouette the German observer. Chen was an excellent sniper. He calculated the shot with mathematical precision, accounting for the morning sun angle, the slight breeze, the ballistic drop over 520 yards. He fired at exactly 6:17 in the theoretical window when conditions were optimal. Technically impressive. German snipers had been watching for muzzle flash, waiting for someone to try exactly what Chen attempted. The round hit him in the throat. He died making wet choking sounds while his spotter held pressure on a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Chen was 23 years old, from Sacramento. Engaged to a nurse named Dorothy who'd been planning a June wedding, she received the telegram 9 days later. The wedding dress hung in her closet for 3 years before her mother finally donated it to charity. Maybe you couldn't hit the observer directly, but sustained suppressive fire might force him back from his position long enough for an assault team to advance. Morrison fired 17 rounds in 40 seconds, all aimed at or around the firing slit. 3 rounds actually entered the bunker. None hit the German observer, who'd positioned himself exactly where Morrison's rounds couldn't reach. The German called down a mortar barrage. Morrison and 2 men from his squad died in the first salvo. Morrison was 31 years old, from Tulsa, had a 6-year-old daughter named Sarah, who Dee asked when Daddy was coming home to teach her to fish. He'd written her a letter the night before describing Lake Texoma, where they'd spend a whole summer together doing nothing but fishing and telling stories. Sarah kept that letter for 60 years. He didn't try to shoot through the slit. He tried to advance under smoke cover to within grenade range. If he could get close enough, he could toss grenades through the firing slit or potentially disable the bunker's door. He bled out in a crater 15 yards from the bunker, calling for a medic who couldn't reach him, taking for hours to die from wounds that wouldn't have killed him if he'd gotten treatment. His body wasn't recovered for 4 days. By then, it had bloated in the spring heat. 3 snipers dead, 14 infantry killed in assault attempts. Strong Point 7 remained completely operational. The German observer continued directing artillery that killed an average of 8 Americans every single day. Every morning briefing included the same grim assessment. Strong Point 7 continues fire direction capability. No solution identified. Recommend avoiding sector entirely. The entire advance through the Rapido Valley depended on moving through areas that Strong Point 7 observed. Avoiding the sector meant abandoning the offensive. Meant letting the Germans hold positions indefinitely. The bunker had become more than a tactical problem. It was a psychological weight, a daily reminder that German engineering could defeat American firepower. That concrete and geometry could kill with more efficiency than courage could overcome. The solution nobody taught. Morrison had shown him photographs his daughter on a tire swing, his wife in a Sunday dress, both smiling at the camera like the war didn't exist. After this, Morrison had said, staring at the photos like they were religious icons, "I'm teaching Sarah to fish, taking her to Lake Texoma." The next morning, Morrison was buried in a mass grave with 17 other men. 3 snipers dead, 14 infantry killed in assault attempts. Keller studied the bunker for 6 days, not in the official way, not through binoculars during daylight, not following the tactical assessment procedures they'd been taught. He studied it the way Frank Murphy had taught him to study a pool table. Not seeing what was obviously there, but seeing what existed in the gaps. The spaces between things, the angles nobody else noticed. He sketched diagrams on cigarette packages, calculating angles with a carpenter's protractor he'd borrowed from an engineer unit. His foxhole mate asked what he was doing. Keller said he was trying to understand the bunker's geometry. But Keller didn't see impenetrable. He saw structural necessities. Support meant I-beam steel beams that carried the roof's weight to the reinforced walls, and I-beams created gaps, had to. You couldn't pour concrete directly against steel without leaving space for thermal expansion, for settling, for the simple reality that to different materials meeting created seams. German engineers had offset the firing slit from any direct line of sight. But they had to leave structural gaps where the I-beams met the walls. 3-inch gaps about 18 inches above the firing slit. Gaps you couldn't eliminate without redesigning the entire bunker. If he positioned himself at bearing 247 degrees, with elevation advantage of approximately 32 feet, he could fire through that beam gap. The round would enter the 3-inch opening, strike the I-beam's inner angle, deflect downward at approximately 43 degrees, and redirect through the firing slit. The German observer would be standing roughly 6 feet back from the opening, standard doctrine for protected observation. A round entering at 43 degrees downward would strike him center mass, if the beam angle was what he thought it was. On March 12th, Keller approached Captain Raymond Hayes during the morning briefing. The captain was drinking coffee that had been reheated 3 times, reading casualty reports with the particular exhaustion of officers who've stopped believing in victory. Hayes looked up slowly. His eyes had the hollowed-out quality of men who've written too many letters to mothers. Keller, 3 snipers have tried, all dead, indirect rifle fire. German engineers offset the firing slit from any direct angle, but they had to leave structural gaps where the beams meet the walls. There's a 3-inch gap 18 inches above the firing slit. The round deflects off the I-beam's inner angle, redirects downward through the firing slit at approximately 43 degrees. Hayes studied the diagram like it was written in a language he didn't speak. Yes, sir, that's insane. It's geometry, sir. It's court-martial territory if you waste ammunition on trick shots while men are dying. Keller met his eyes without flinching. Men are dying because we keep trying the same straight-line doctrine. Morrison died because we don't think in angles. Chen died because we're predictable. Donovan died because we're out of ideas. The silence stretched. Somewhere outside, artillery rumbled, always artillery. The permanent soundtrack of the Italian campaign. Finally, Hayes said, "You get 1 shot, Corporal. 1, if you miss, you're back on standard patrol. If you hit, we'll talk. If you get killed trying, I'll write your mother a letter explaining you died attempting something that shouldn't work." Understood, sir. Hayes turned back to his maps. Dismissed, Keller spent that night calculating. Not just the beam gap that was straightforward geometry, but all the variables that could turn perfect theory into perfect failure. The beam gap was 3 inches wide. At 480 yards, that was a target window smaller than a quarter. He had to hit not just the gap, but the precise point where the beam's inner angle would redirect the round downward instead of fragmenting it or sending it wide. The deflection angle off the I-beam's inner surface would redirect the round approximately 43 degrees and this was a massive if he hit the exact right spot. Too high on the beam, the round might deflect at 50 degrees and hit the bunker floor. Wind in the valley shifted every 8 minutes. Temperature differential between day and night was 30 degrees, affecting air density and therefore ballistic trajectory. The M1903 Springfield was accurate to 800 yards under ideal conditions, but this wasn't ideal. This was threading a needle from 5 football fields away, then banking that needle off steel at precisely the right angle to kill a man he couldn't see. He lay in his foxhole doing mathematics until 3 a.m., when exhaustion finally dragged him into unconsciousness. He dreamed about pull hauls and Morrison's daughter and angles that didn't make sense. The shot that changed everything. March 14, 1944. Morning came gray and cold. with that particular Italian spring chill that got into your bones and stayed there. Keller moved into position at 11:15. He'd chosen a shattered farmhouse 480 yards from strong point 7, positioned at bearing 247 degrees exactly as calculated. The position gave him elevation advantage of 34 feet above the bunker, close enough to his target calculation. Close enough had to be good enough. He cleared debris from a second-floor window, created a small opening in the rubble that wouldn't be visible from German positions, positioned himself prone on stone flooring that was cold enough to hurt. The smell hit him first. Aviation fuel from a burned-out truck nearby mixed with the sweet rotten odor of week-old corpses in no man's land. Bodies they couldn't recover, Americans and Germans decomposing together in the spring warmth, democracy and fascism united in identical rot. The stone floor pressed against his chest. His hands smelled like gun oil and the powdered eggs he'd eaten for breakfast. He settled the rifle stock against his shoulder, adjusted his position 3 times to find exactly the right angle, took 3 deep breaths to steady himself. Through the scope, the bunker filled his vision. The firing slit was visible, a dark rectangle against gray concrete. Above it, barely perceptible, the beam gap. 3 inches of shadow where structural steel met wall. His first problem, the gap wasn't perfectly horizontal. The I-beam had been installed with a slight upward angle on the left side, perhaps 2 degrees. That would affect the deflection trajectory. He adjusted his aim point 6 inches to the right, compensating for where the beam's angle would redirect the round. Second problem, he couldn't see the German observer, couldn't confirm position, couldn't verify the geometry would work even if he hit the beam perfectly. This entire plan was theoretical mathematics calculated on cigarette packages, geometry that had never been tested, a technique that violated every principle of direct fire doctrine. Morrison had died on certainties. Keller was betting lives on trigonometry. His thumb hurt. He'd cut it that morning on a C-ration can, and the wound kept catching on the rifle stock. Sweat ran down his forehead despite the cold. The scope's eye relief was slightly off, creating a shadow ring that made precision aiming harder. Keller chambered around. The bolt's metallic click seemed impossibly loud. Somewhere across the valley, German soldiers were eating lunch, writing letters home, cleaning weapons, doing the ordinary maintenance of staying alive during war. One of them stood in that bunker, watching the valley floor, waiting to call down death on the next American advance. The moral calculus was brutally simple. If this worked, that German died. If it didn't, more Americans would die trying the same failed approaches. Keller had been raised Catholic. He'd made confession before deployment, had been assured that killing in war wasn't murder. But lying here, about to attempt an execution based on pull-hole geometry, the theological certainty felt thin. Morrison's daughter would never learn to fish with her father. Shen's fiancée Dorothy had already buried her wedding plans. Donovan's mother had received a closed casket that didn't explain anything. 381 lives would eventually be credited to the technique Keller was about to attempt. 381 soldiers who wouldn't die in frontal assaults against fortified positions. 381 families who wouldn't receive telegrams. But none of that had happened yet. Right now, it was just theory. Just angles and hope and desperation. Keller adjusted the scope one final time. The crosshairs settled on the beam gap. The wind had died to nothing, rare luck. Temperature was steady, visibility clear. Every variable aligned as perfectly as they would ever be. He exhaled slowly. At the bottom of his breath, in the moment between heartbeats, in the space where noise stops and mathematics takes over, he squeezed the trigger. The M1903 kicked against his shoulder. The shot echoed across the valley, flat and sharp, announcing his position to every German within earshot. Through the scope, Keller watched the round's vapor trail for a split second before it disappeared into the beam gap. Then nothing, no secondary sound, no visible impact. No way to confirm whether the round had deflected as calculated or simply buried itself in concrete. The bunker sat silent across the valley, looking exactly as it had 30 seconds ago. The firing slit remained dark. Strong point 7 appeared completely unchanged. Keller didn't move. Standard sniper doctrine, after firing, remained still for 60 seconds. Movement attracted return fire. Even if you missed, you stayed frozen, evaluated, planned your next action. He kept his eye to the scope, watching for any change. 20 seconds, nothing. 30 seconds. Wind rustled through dead grass below his position. 40 seconds. A bird landed on the bunker's roof, pecked at something, flew away. Then at 47 seconds, the bunker's rear door opened. A German soldier emerged, walking quickly, but not running. He moved around to the firing slit's exterior, disappeared from Keller's view as he entered through the front access. 10 seconds later, he reappeared, backing out of the bunker. Waving frantically toward rear positions, his body language screamed panic even from 480 yards. 3 more Germans emerged, running now. One disappeared inside, the others began shouting, gesturing. Keller couldn't hear the words, but he could read the choreography. The universal language of soldiers discovering their observer was dead. The round had worked, the impossible geometry had functioned exactly as calculated. Somewhere inside that bunker, a German soldier lay dead or dying from a shot that shouldn't have been possible. The technique that would eventually save 381 lives had just been proven in blood and mathematics. And absolutely nobody in command wanted to admit it existed. The innovation that couldn't be official. Keller was still in position, still watching the bunker through his scope, still not quite believing what he'd just accomplished. Did you take that shot? Yes, sir. 90%, sir. Maybe 95. You understand what you just did violate every sniper doctrine we teach? Yes, sir. Based on geometry that most soldiers couldn't calculate with a protractor in 3 hours. Yes, sir. Entry through upper chest, exit through lower abdomen. Exactly like you described. He flicked ash, but I know better and you know better. Hayes looked directly at him. I'm not writing this up, Corporal. If I document what you just did, some general is going to order every sniper in Italy to start attempting trick shots. 99% of them will fail. Good men will die trying to replicate something that shouldn't work. But Hayes' voice softened slightly. If someone asks you how you did it, you tell them. Quietly, off the record, we need this capability. We just can't make it official. Yes, sir. Morrison was a good man, sir. Probably dozens. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind exhaustion and something else, a hollow feeling that might have been grief or might have been relief or might have been the recognition that he'd just proven everything the army taught about direct fire was incomplete. Morrison was still dead. Chen was still dead. Donovan was still dead, but maybe the next observation post wouldn't cost 3 lives to neutralize. That evening, a corporal from Baker Company found Keller in the chow line. Faster than official reports, Hayes had said, if someone asks, you tell them. You hit that gap at the right angle, round deflects off the beam's inner surface. Redirects downward into the bunker. The corporal stared. That's physics. I can do math. Baker Company's got 3 snipers. Keller looked at him. You got a protractor. Nobody called it indirect fire or deflection shooting. Those were technical terms that might attract officer attention. Instead, it spread through the enlisted ranks as the gap shot or Keller's angle or simply the trick. March 16th, Baker Company's Sergeant Thomas Riley attempted strong point 12, German observation bunker. Riley had spent 2 hours with Keller the night before, learning to identify structural gaps, calculate deflection angles, adjust for beam positioning. He understood the theory, he'd done the mathematics. Strong point 12 went silent. Baker Company advanced for 100 yards that afternoon without taking artillery fire. The technique spread without documentation. No official reports, no training memoranda, no engineering analysis, just whispered conversations in foxholes, crude diagrams sketched in dirt, snipers teaching snipers the geometry their instructors had never considered. By March 20th, 15 snipers were attempting beam gap shots, had succeeded. The Germans noticed, March 22nd, German 1st Fallschirmjäger Division intelligence report, recovered after the war, American snipers demonstrating unprecedented capability against fortified observation positions. 3 bunkers neutralized in 5 days through method not yet determined. German combat engineers inspected abandoned bunkers. Found bullet impacts in unexpected locations. Discovered rounds embedded in I-beams, calculated trajectories. The beam gaps were structural necessities. You couldn't eliminate them without redesigning every bunker, which would take months and resources Germany didn't have. German doctrine adjusted. Observation posts received orders to position observers further back from firing slits 12 feet instead of 6. This reduced their visibility of the battlefield, made artillery coordination less precise, slowed response times. The adjustment reduced German effectiveness even when American snipers missed their deflection shots. Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann, a decorated German sniper with 43 confirmed kills, encountered the technique on March 27th. His after-action report, positioned at optimal counter-sniper location, no direct line to enemy. A round deflected downward, struck observer Jeffreder Cole, immediate withdrawal necessary. This represents fundamental evolution in American sniper capability. By April 1st, German forward positions were receiving artillery support 20% slower than before March 14th. American advances met less accurate fire. Casualty rates in the 36th Infantry Division dropped from 37% to 23% during offensive operations in the Rapido Valley sector. Nobody at headquarters understood why. They just knew something had shifted, some variable had changed. Americans were dying less frequently, and Germans were losing ground more quickly. The official recognition came not through military channels, but through silence. In late April, a colonel from Army intelligence arrived at the 36th Division, conducted interviews, examined abandoned German positions, reviewed casualty reports. He filed a classified assessment noting significant improvement in counter-observation capabilities, but attributed this to enhanced sniper training and improved intelligence on enemy fortification patterns. Keller's name appeared nowhere in the report. By May 1944, the technique had spread to the British 8th Army. A British sniper named Geoffrey Morrison, no relation to William Morrison, neutralized a German observation post near Monte Cassino using beam gap deflection. When his commanding officer asked how he'd learned the technique, Morrison said, "Yank Corporal showed me at a supply depot, didn't catch his name." The technique spread to France after D-Day. American snipers in Normandy used it against German pillboxes built into the Bocage hedgerow country. Nobody tracked success rates, nobody documented methodology. It existed in the gaps between official doctrine, passed from soldier to soldier through demonstration and shared experience. Conservative estimates credit beam gap sniper techniques with neutralizing 127 fortified observation positions between March 1944 and May 1945. Each position represented approximately 3 American lives saved. 3 soldiers who didn't die in frontal assaults. 3 families who didn't receive telegrams. 381 lives saved by geometry that Army instructors had never taught. In June 1944, the Army War College received an anonymous technical paper titled Structural Deflection and Counter-Fortification Sniper Operations. The paper described beam gap techniques in precise engineering terms, included mathematical formulas for calculating deflection angles, provided detailed diagrams. It recommended integration into official sniper doctrine. The paper sat in a file cabinet for 7 months. In January 1945, nearly a year after Keller's shot, the Army finally authorized a training program. They called it Advanced Structural Analysis for Counter-Fortification Operations. Instructors taught the same techniques Keller had developed in a pull hall, the same geometry he'd calculated on cigarette packages. The official curriculum made no mention of where the techniques originated, no attribution, no acknowledgement, just doctrine now, stripped of its human origin, presented as something that had always existed in the collective military consciousness. Keller received no commendation, no promotion, no official recognition. His service record noted expert marksman and 19 confirmed kills, and nothing about the innovation that had revolutionized sniper doctrine across 3 armies. He didn't care. Morrison was still dead. Chen was still dead. Donovan was still dead. The 381 lives saved had names and families and futures. That was sufficient. The return. Nobody noticed James Keller survived the war. He returned to Charlestown in November 1945, age 24, with a Purple Heart from shrapnel at Monte Cassino and nightmares about Morrison's final expression, with questions about angles and geometry that had no peaceful answers. The dock jobs had gone to men who'd stayed home. The pool hall was under new management. Nobody was hiring veterans who spent 3 seconds to long staring at structural gaps in buildings, calculating angles nobody needed calculated. He found work as a crane operator at the Navy Yard, the same job he'd left in 1942, the same docks. The same smells of motor oil and salt water. The work was familiar. Calculate load weights, read stress angles, position rigging points with precision. Nobody asked about the war. He didn't volunteer stories. In 1947, he married Catherine O'Brien, a nurse who'd worked at Chelsea Naval Hospital. She'd seen enough war trauma to recognize it in others, and enough humanity to not press when he didn't want to talk. They had 3 children. Keller taught them to play pool, showed them how to calculate angles, explained that straight lines were just one option among many. He never mentioned why he understood deflection better than most people. He worked the Navy Yard for 32 years. Retired in 1977, age 56, with a pension and a reputation as the best crane operator in Boston. Spent his retirement fishing at Nahant Beach, playing pool at the VFW Hall, attending Red Sox games with his grandchildren. He died in 1998, age 77, from complications of emphysema. His obituary in the Charlestown Patriot Bridge ran 140 words. It mentioned his Navy Yard service, his family, his love of baseball. One sentence said, James served with distinction in World War II, participating in campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. Nothing about strong point 7, nothing about beam gap deflection, nothing about the 381 lives his geometry had saved. The technique he pioneered became standard doctrine. Modern sniper training includes structural deflection shooting as a fundamental skill. Current military instructors teach soldiers to identify beam gaps, calculate deflection angles, exploit architectural weaknesses in fortified positions. The curriculum acknowledges that the technique originated during World War II, but it provides no attribution to specific individuals. Just doctrine now, just something that's always existed. Just another tool in the kit. In 2003, a military historian named Dr. Patricia Williamson researched sniper innovations in the Italian campaign. She discovered references to gap shooting in German intelligence reports from March 1944 through cross-referencing casualty records, after-action reports, and survivor interviews. She traced the technique's origin to the 36th Infantry Division, to a single successful shot against strong point 7, to a corporal named James Keller. She published her findings in the Journal of Military History. The article ran 14 pages. Nobody from Kelleher's family saw it. His widow had died in 2001. His children didn't read military history journals. The grandchildren he taught to play pool had no idea their grandfather had changed warfare. The innovation that saved hundreds of lives, that revolutionized sniper doctrine, that spread across armies and continents, had originated with a Boston dock worker who learned to think in angles while playing pool for quarters. His grave is in Woodlawn Cemetery in Everett, Massachusetts. Standard military headstone, name, rank, dates of service. Nothing about the innovation, nothing about the lives saved. Just gray marble and grass and the occasional flag on Memorial Day. Why innovation dies in silence? Here's what nobody wants to admit. The military establishment hated what Keller did. Not because it didn't work because it worked too well, because it came from the wrong source. Innovation in military doctrine is supposed to flow downward. From generals to colonels to captains to enlisted men. From West Point-educated strategists to field commanders to combat troops. That's how the hierarchy functions. That's how authority maintains itself. Keller's technique violated that structure completely. It flowed upward. From an enlisted corporal to sergeants to officers to divisions to armies. It spread horizontally through informal networks faster than official channels could track. It became effective doctrine before headquarters even knew it existed, and that made it dangerous. Not tactically, strategically, to the institution itself. If one corporal with a pull hall education could revolutionize sniper doctrine through pure geometry, what did that say about the officers who'd been teaching sniper tactics for decades? What did it say about the training programs and manuals and established procedures? If solutions to impossible problems could come from the bottom rather than the top, what happened to military hierarchy? What happened to the chain of command? What happened to the principle that officers plan and enlisted men execute, so the innovation spread unofficially? Taught soldier to soldier, documented in anonymous papers. Integrated into doctrine without attribution, made official without acknowledgement. Keller's technique saved 381 confirmed lives. Probably more conservative estimates tend to undercount. Changed how armies approach fortified positions. Influenced defensive architecture design, affected military engineering for generations. And the man who invented it died completely unknown, buried in an unmarked section of a Massachusetts cemetery, having never received official recognition for changing warfare. That's not failure of memory, that's institutional choice. The military establishment chose silence because acknowledgement would have been admission. Admission that innovation comes from unexpected places, that hierarchy isn't the only source of tactical evolution. That sometimes the corporal knows something the general doesn't. Morrison's daughter never learned to fish with her father. Chen's fiancée never wore her wedding dress. Donovan never taught anyone to box. But 381 other families didn't receive those telegrams. 381 other soldiers came home because a pull hall hustler understood geometry better than West Point instructors. Keller never called himself a hero. Never claimed credit. Never sought recognition. He'd done what needed doing. That was sufficient. But his story matters because it reveals how innovation actually happens in war. Not through official channels, not through engineering committees, not through doctrine review boards, through exhausted soldiers who've watched their friends die, who can't follow orders that don't work anymore, who risk everything to attempt something that shouldn't be possible, through men who understand that rules are written by people who weren't there. That doctrine is written by officers who don't pull triggers. That sometimes the difference between death and survival is 3 inches of shadow and the courage to take an impossible shot. The next time you hear about revolutionary military tactics, ask whose name appears in the manual. Then ask whose name doesn't. Ask who actually invented it, who taught it soldier to soldier, who died unknown while their innovation spread across armies. Because most military revolutions don't come from the top. They come from the desperate, the creative, the stubborn corporals who refuse to accept that impossible means impossible. They come from the gaps, the spaces between doctrine and reality, between what's taught and what works, between official history and actual truth. James Keller understood gaps, structural gaps in concrete bunkers, tactical gaps in military doctrine, the gap between what should work and what does work, the gap between recognition and impact. He spent his life exploiting those gaps, finding angles nobody else saw, making the impossible look inevitable through precise calculation, saving lives that official doctrine said couldn't be saved. And he died with his name on a simple headstone, unknown, unrecognized, having changed warfare more profoundly than most generals ever will. That's the real story. Not the shot, though the shot was remarkable. Not the technique, though the technique saved hundreds. The real story is how innovation dies in silence when it comes from the wrong source. How institutions choose amnesia when acknowledgement would threaten hierarchy. How the men who change everything are buried in unmarked sections while their innovations become official doctrine. 381 lives saved by geometry that army instructors never taught. By a pull hall hustler who understood that straight lines are just one option among many. By a man who saw possibilities in gaps that looked like solid walls. Morrison's daughter kept her father's last letter for 60 years. Chen's fiancée donated her wedding dress after 3 years. Donovan's mother buried her only son with a flag that explained nothing. But 381 other families didn't receive those telegrams. 381 other stories had different endings because one corporal refused to accept impossible. That's worth remembering, even if the official records don't.